Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Raw. Um, this chapter is about meeting my inner child. Today's chapter is actually one of the most important ones in my journey because it's where I finally began to understand why I was the way I was. For most of my life, I thought I was just an anxious person. I I thought I was a people pleaser, someone who overthought everything, someone who needed reassurance, um, someone who always worried about losing people I loved. I thought those were simply personality traits, but I had no idea that many of those patterns had been quietly following me since I was a little boy. So when people hear the words childhood trauma, they always imagine something extreme. Okay, we think like abuse, violence, neglect, and although those experiences absolutely exist and leave deep scars, that's not the only childhood wounds. That's not how childhood wounds are created. So I think that's an important thing to understand. And, sometimes our deepest wounds aren't created by one horrific event. Sometimes they're created by small moments that seem insignificant to an adult, but feel enormous to a child. And a child, for example, being left alone for the first time and feeling terrified, that can be a childhood trauma. Moving schools and suddenly losing everything, every friend you had, feeling like you don't belong, parents separating, or a teacher embarrassing you in front of the class or a peer. Always feeling like they have to earn love for approval. Like those moments may only last a moment, but to a child, they can shape beliefs that last a lifetime. Children don't have the life experience to understand what's happening around them. They simply make meaning from what they feel. Like, I must not be enough, or I have to be good to be loved. I can't let people down. People always leave. Those beliefs often follow us into adulthood without us ever realizing it. And looking back now, I can see some of those moments in my own life. My parents separated when I was really young. I changed school a few times, moved to a different city. I was always a new kid trying to fit in, and home wasn't always peaceful. There were challenges within my family that taught me to constantly read the room. And without realizing it, I became hypervigilant, always watching people's moods, trying to avoid conflict, trying to keep everybody happy, trying to make sure everything stayed peaceful, because somewhere inside me that felt safe. And as I got older, that became people pleasing. I overgave. I wanted everyone to like me. I wanted to fit in. And I wore different masks depending on who I was around. Not because I was fake, but because I didn't believe the real me was enough. Okay? And one memory stands out more than most. Right before grade 7, I found out I would be moving back to Cap to live with my dad. And whether that decision was right or wrong isn't the point. But looking back today, I understand that my younger self experienced it as abandonment. Not because my parents intended that, but because that's how a child's mind understands loss. And children don't think like adults. They don't say my parents are doing the best they can. Instead they ask, did I do something wrong? Why am I leaving? Why wasn't I enough? So those questions can quietly stay with us for decades. And for years, I couldn't understand why distance in relationships affected me so deeply. You know, if someone needed space, I felt panic. If someone didn't answer my messages, I felt rejected. If someone pulled away, my mind immediately believed they were leaving. So, I thought I was reacting to the present, but I wasn't. I, I wasn't. Often I was reacting from a wound that had never been healed. And that realization changed my life because I stopped asking what's wrong with me. And I started asking what happened that taught me to believe this. Okay? And that question changed everything. And a huge part of that journey has been working with my inner child therapist, Angèle Lantier, from Peeling Onions. I genuinely want to take a moment to recognize her because she's been such an important part of my healing. She's challenged me in ways I never expected, not by giving me answers, but by asking me questions I would never have asked myself. Questions that forced me to look beneath behaviors and discover what was really driving them. And one session changed my perspective forever. At the time, I was working incredibly hard on myself. I was journaling every day, going to therapy 4 or 5 times a month, doing my inner child work, and I was tracking my progress. And sometimes I would even share that progress with people because I wanted them to know I was changing. And I thought I was simply being open, but Angèle asked me, and I'll never forget. She said, "Scott, what if that's your inner child asking to be seen?" And that question stopped me in my tracks because she was right. Deep inside me, there was still a little boy in there saying, look at me, see me, I'm doing the work, can you see I'm trying? So that was a big realization. And, it wasn't manipulation. It wasn't about attention. It was a child who still wanted to know he mattered. And that's when I truly understood what inner child healing is. And it's not pretending your childhood was terrible because, I had a great childhood overall. It's not blaming your parents. It's not staying stuck in the past. It's about recognizing that the child inside you learned certain ways to survive. And many of those survival strategies become your adult personality, like people-pleasing, perfectionism, hypervigilance, needing validation, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment. Those aren't character flaws. And many of them were brilliant survival strategies. And for a child, the problem is children grow up. But sometimes those strategies don't. They stay with us. And healing isn't about getting rid of your inner child. It's about finally meeting him, listening to him, understanding him, and giving him what he needed all along, which is, safety, acceptance, compassion, love, not from someone else, but from you. So, because the truth is, the little boy inside me was never broken. He was simply doing the best he could with the life he had. And I think that's true for so many of us. Maybe the adult you're struggling with today is simply a child who's still waiting to feel safe. And if this chapter encourages you to do one thing, I hope it's this. Instead of asking, what's wrong with me? Ask, what happened that taught me to believe this? Okay? That's one question that might change your life. The same way it changed mine. So, till next time, have a good day.